If you're just joining me, somewhat improbably, I began today's programme with three names, Mateless, Marks and Dixville. Dixville being the little place in New Hampshire that posts its election results first and gave me an indication quite early last night that things were going to go Donald Trump's way. There are only 6 residents of this village. And in 2020, they all voted for Joe Biden. Yesterday, 3 of them voted for Kamala Harris and 3 of them voted for Donald Trump. And I just thought those are the people that we don't understand. The people who can look at the choice between, and I'm not going to read you the long list of Donald Trump's egregious transgressions again, but they can vote knowingly for that. And we are the people perhaps most baffled, most befuddled this morning. Listening to our news, looking at some polling of how America has responded to this. The other 2 reasons, by the way, Mateless and Marks. Mateless because she told me a year ago, shortly after landing in America, when I asked her what people are up to, what people are talking about politically, she was struck by how many people were talking about the price of petrol, which is both a fact and also a perfect analogy for the cost of living, or the pound, the dollar in your pocket. And then the thing that I think best distills this sort of the grounds for a form of despair would be the conversation I had with Simon Marks yesterday. If you need to mark how far the needle has moved, how uncharted these waters are for Western democracies, certainly in the from the post-war period onwards, then you would have to hear Simon and I talking very casually yesterday about how, well, in many ways, it would be a good thing if the victory was quite clear. Because a narrow victory for Kamala Harris, even if you wanted it desperately, would have opened the door to January the 6th 2.0. And this time he might have pulled it off. And that, I think, is the best illustration of how bonkers this conversation is, how bonkers American politics is. You're looking at your greatest ally historically. You're looking at the most powerful country in the world. And you're thinking, well, maybe it'd be better. Maybe it'd be better if the guy I think is awful won. Because if he lost, he might try to steal the election again. And that would be even worse than anything he could do if he won. You see the trouble with that logic. But, I mean, you're nodding along. You know it's true. Unless, of course, you're comfortable with people stealing elections, in which case I'm not sure yet whether or not you're aware of what that looks like historically. 8 minutes after 11 is the time. So if the Liberal democratic norms do not matter, or at least they do not matter to enough people enough of the time, where does that leave us? What does that say about the world? How did this happen is a conversation that we had long before it happened, and we had it on many, many different occasions. But this idea that we look at appalling things and presume that they're deal breakers is wrong. They're not deal breakers. But you can't abandon the belief or the conviction that they should be. So what do you do? Paul Krugman is an award-winning, Nobel Prize-winning economist, writes op-eds for the New York Times sometimes. He's already responded in some ways to this question. He says, don't ask whose fault this was. Plenty of time for second-guessing and recriminations. Ask instead, what can you do? For my part, that means telling the truth as I see it, as long as I can. The media will be under a lot of pressure to toe the line. Don't capitulate in advance. And I think by towing the line, he means normalizing what Donald Trump represents, because he has this incredible mandate. That's not an opinion, that's counting. He's got an incredible mandate now to do whatever he wants in America. And yet he is all of the things that we know him to be. So what you can't do, I don't think, and I think this is the point that Krugman is making, what you can't do, however tempting it is sort of go, oh, well, that's the new reality. That's the world we live in. Rape doesn't matter. Stealing elections is not a deal breaker. And being condemned in the roundest terms by almost all of your closest allies ever, last time you were in power, is not something that we should focus on as we approach the next period of power. I think that it's tempting, isn't it? Because everybody likes an easy life. It's almost as if Paul Krugman is saying, don't stop being horrified. And then you're reminded of some of the articles that appeared last time he got into the White House. Donald Trump won't be as bad as you think is one that Andrew Neil published. Donald Trump won't be as bad as you think. I mean, the mad reality in 2024 is Donald Trump was much, much worse than all of the most hysterical predictions suggested he would be. And America have just put him back in the White House. Riddle me that. 0345 6060973. And this was my trail at 9:45 this morning. I hesitate to ask this question, but what is the worst that could happen? I want you to put some flesh on the bones of that question. So I think Vladimir Putin would have been raising a glass last night, don't you? I think the idea of Volodymyr Zelensky continuing to enjoy the support of the United States of America is disappearing over the horizon. I suspect, despite all of his incredibly febrile local difficulties, which we'll be talking about at about 12:30 with our correspondent in Jerusalem, Benjamin Netanyahu will be very happy with this result. So Vladimir Putin, Benjamin Netanyahu, you heard talk of Viktor Orban being very happy with this result. In the context of the Brits, the UK, or the broader global picture, what is the worst that can happen? Commercially, if he brings in tariffs, as he is threatened to do, we will suffer enormously. The research on that from our economic experts is pretty close to incontrovertible. But what is the worst that can happen? Sometimes that's a soothing, a calming thought. I read Alexei Navalny's book, Patriot, which is an extraordinary read. You heard an interview with his widow Yulia last week. And Alexei had two tactics for dealing with despair. And remember, this is a man that was poisoned several times by Vladimir Putin, jailed and ultimately murdered. And of course, one of the questions he was constantly asked was, how do you do it? How do you keep going? And one of the answers he gave, one was faith, actually, which is a conversation for another day. But the other one he gave was, you just need to imagine what is the worst that can happen, up to and including his own murder. And the more you think about it, the less frightening it becomes. I think in therapeutic terms, it's called sort of sitting with your pain. The world turns, life goes on. This too shall pass. We are, in the great scheme of things, we're grains of sand on an enormous beach, so none of this matters. So the more you think about what's the worst that can happen, it's not like the species is, it's not like the species is going to have its extinction accelerated, but of course anybody remotely informed on climate change matters would be right to worry. Anybody supportive of Ukraine would be right to worry. Anybody who recognises the importance of science, particularly in the context of healthcare, would be right to worry, because Donald Trump has talked about putting a man who is a vaccine conspiracy theorist in charge of American healthcare. What is the worst? You might struggle to get through, but please try. Be patient. I'll stop talking so I can squeeze in some more calls. But whether this turns up the volume on the despair, or whether it turns it down, only time will tell. But what is the worst that could happen? Plausibly, in your opinion.